Okay, so moving on with our tour, we have a very quick introduction to models. Next, we're going to get a quick introduction to controllers and views, the other two pieces of the MVC equation. And let's go back to our cookbook approach. We already know how to add a new model or change things about an existing model. Now we want to add a new action, a new thing that you can do to a model. So to add a new action, remember what do you need in a model view controller system? Well, in order for the controller to do its work, you've got to be able to get from a URI to which method in the controller is going to actually handle that. And we saw that the routing subsystem is where that gets done. And there's a file called routes.rb that you can set up, although the default setup essentially gives you the routes for all of the CRUD actions on your models. You also need to add the actual code that does the thing you want to do. And remember that when we say add controller code, most of the time, really where the action happens is in the model, right? The controller code is really just there to mediate between the views and what's in the model. So the code that you are adding in the controller tends to be pretty small. You've probably already added the code in the model that does the actual work. All you need to do now is basically connect that to the rest of your app. Make sure that there's something for it to render. So remember, the HTTP is a request-reply protocol. That means that whenever you do a request to the server, something's got to come back. Usually that something is a view, so you've got to make sure that there is some view associated with the action. One possibility is that each view or each action has its own separate view associated with it, but as we'll see, another possibility is to essentially reuse the same view for different actions. As long as there is something to be rendered, you're OK. So we're going to use the show action and the view that goes along with it as our walkthrough example here. The book walks through the index action, which is a little bit different, so this way you get two different types. So remember the responsibilities in model view controller. The model is where all the action happens. The model manipulates the data, talks to the database. The controller gets stuff out of the model and makes it available to the view. So what method are we going to write? We're going to write the method that, or the controller action, I would guess, that given that you want to see information about a particular movie, is going to get that information from the model, or from the database via the model, I guess, and create a view that displays that information, kind of a detail view. The reason that we can expect to create a method that can consume the primary key ID of something is when we create the index, which is the listing of all movies, next to each one there's a link that takes you to the detail page for that movie. And those links are basically constructed so that their route already includes the ID of the movie. So the end user would never be expected to know this, but if the end user is just picking something off of a list, and if we get to generate that list, we can just make sure that the links already all point to the right place. And that's what the index example walkthrough in the book sets up. It sets up a view where all of the links have the ID embedded in them. So we're going to show where all this comes from. But remember, the overall template here is when we set an instance variable like @movie in a controller method, it's going to magically become available in the view. The view is going to display the data, maybe allow the user to do something with it. In this case, it's going to be showing some description of the movie text and a rating and some other stuff. And we'll show the view in a moment. And then we'll see what other things we might want to put on that page. And how does the user get to that page to begin with? So let's go to paste bin. OK. So what's our view going to look like? Well, we're going to assume that we can set up that @movie variable so that in the view, we can just have details about. We can use the @movie variable and dereference its title. We can dereference its release date and pretty print it in a nice way. We can dereference its rating. So this is HAML. So how did we get to this point, right? How do we actually figure out the controller methods, the routes, and so forth that we need to use to do this? One of the nice things that Rails gives you is basically built-in helpers that will generate URLs that have the right thing in them. So we said when we generate that list of movies in the index view, that the links that can be generated automatically have the right information in them to include things like the primary key of the movie. This is a table that's actually reproduced from the book. And it shows that one of the default route set that you get when you create a new app is that for each model, you get routes that will allow you to generate RESTful URIs for the index action, which is list all of the instances you have, the CRUD actions, create, read, update, delete, and actions called new and edit, which are only necessary in a web browser because they're sort of half of doing an operation. And when you think about when you create a new movie, from your point of view as a human being, there's actually two steps involved, right? You have to get a blank form that you fill in, and then you submit the form, and the data in the form is what's used to create the movie. So the reason that it looks like, even though we're only doing the CRUD actions, that there's 7 things here, well, one of them is the index action, which is not really a CRUD action, but it's list all elements of the collection. And the other two, new and edit, are sort of the first half of an interaction that takes 2 steps to do. So we're going to start from that index view that the book develops. And in the code that's in the view, you'll see things like link to movie path with a primary key in it. Movie path is what's going to generate this URL helper. So given movie path and an argument, it's going to turn it into a URL that looks like this, and then it encodes the ID of the movie we want to see. And in the view, that's going to end up looking like just a plain old link that you can click on. The URL is already constructed. And when it gets matched against the different routes, it's going to match the movie's ID route with the get method. That means that the ID is a stand-in. It's a wildcard for this part of the route, the digit 3. So that's going to be available in the params array that our controller action sees. Right? So we're starting the moving parts one by one. First moving part is figure out what route does this URI match. And if there's any wildcards embedded in that route, pull the wildcard parameters out, make them available as part of the params hash. And now we also know from rake routes what controller action that's going to call. And how do we know that? Well, I'm going to look in my application here, which I'm going to temporarily stop. If I run rake routes, it will look into my routes file and show me all of the mappings that have already been set up for me. Right? So this is saying that, for example, when I'm doing get of a single movie, when I get with a URL that matches movies / ID with ID as a wildcard, that's going to try to call the show action in the movies controller. So that's where my code logically has to go in order to handle that request. Let's get the app started again. Ouch. Okay, so we've seen that. URI matches. Wildcards get pulled out. We know which controller action we're going to call. And in that controller action, which in our case is really short, the one and only thing it needs to do is get information from the model. And it does that by calling movie.find. We know the primary key of the movie the user wants to look at, so we can just look it up directly. We're going to assign that to the instance variable movie, and then that variable becomes available in the view. What is the view? Well, remember we said by convention over configuration, you don't have to worry about the names of things as long as you follow some rules. The rule here is that when you finish executing a controller action, unless you say otherwise, Rails will look for a view that has the same name but with html.erb or html.haml attached to it. In that case, we'll look for show.html.haml in the movies subdirectory of views. We'll render it, and if there's any variables that are used in the view, like @movie, we'll substitute the values that the controller computed. That's basically the round trip through the app. We could also let the user return to the movie list. We could, for example, what's the RESTful URI that names the collection, the list of all movies? Well, there's a helper called movies path that will return a route that maps to the index action, and rake routes would show that. So movies path with no arguments links to the index action. So we could put something in our view that says, here's some text to show, and here's the hyperlink. The URL will be generated by calling this method. And again, the reason that this is all segregated in the routing subsystem is if you change the names of routes, the way some of the routes work, you don't have to manually propagate those changes through all of your HTML templates because you're generating the routes at runtime based on the information out of that file.